जन गण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता। पंजाब सिंधु गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल गंगा। विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्छल जलधि तरंगा। तब शुभ नामे जागे तब शुभ आशीष मांगे। गाहे तब जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता। जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे।
Good morning and welcome to the 40th Scotch Summit. We are all indeed grateful to the Honourable Minister for Women and Child Development, Shrimati Menaka Sanjay Gandhi, to have taken time out from a very busy schedule and come just for this inaugural to Mumbai. I'm very grateful to you, Madam. We have the privilege of having with us Mr. S. Ramadurai, Chairman BSc, as well as Head of National Skill Development Council. We have Mrs. Dina Mehta, who needs no introduction. She's been one of the stalwarts of the markets. We have Mr. Ashish Kumar Chauhan, CEO and MD of Bombay Stock Exchange, and we have Dr. Deepak Phatak. He's director on Scotch Development Foundation, but more importantly, he's a professor at IIT Mumbai and has been the driving force behind initiatives like Akash, massively online open learning systems, so on and so forth. I also have my friend and colleague, Dr. Gursharan Dhanjal, CEO of the Scotch Group, sitting next to me. Welcome to you all. Just to share with you, some time back, Mr. Narendra Modi had made a statement that India today is a $2 trillion economy. Now, why can we not be a $20 trillion economy? And that kind of kick-started a thought process that, wow, what a wonderful idea that is. If we are able to achieve that, we would surpass all superpowers that there are. So we said, now who's going to kind of work on an implementation plan for this stream? So we conceptualized this conference. To my mind, we need a sectoral approach, which is, if in a $2 trillion economy, this is where we are on insurance penetration, then in a 20 trillion economy, where should we be? If this is where we are on payments in a $2 trillion economy, where should we be in a $20 trillion economy? And actually, some of these have to progress geometrically for us to actually realize the dream of this 20 trillion economy. So what we have done over the next 2 days is that we brought together different sectoral experts who will be, through the plenaries and various workshops, be returning concrete recommendations as to what is it that they need to do in their sector, what they will do, what people should do, and more importantly, what is it that the government should do to help us all achieve this common dream. As you know, I have been a votary of inclusive growth all my life, coming from a poor background myself. I feel a lot for the poor of India, and for me, any economy which is 20 trillion and not inclusive, where the wealth is not equitably distributed, is not a good economy. So to that extent, possibly you can say that I am fairly influenced by the Gandhian thinking. And as you know that I had written a book, my last book was called Defeating Poverty, Jan Dhan and Beyond. And I am always amazed when I ask various people this question as to why are people poor. The kind of answers you get are amazing. Somebody says they're poor because they're not empowered. Somebody says that they are not educated. Somebody says they have poor health services. And to all of them I say, people are poor because they don't have any money. So everything that you do has to be focused towards how do you put some money in their pocket. So unless and until you're doing livelihood, giving them jobs, making them to do things with their mind or their hands, and helping them come up the economic value chain, poverty cannot be defeated. Everything else is symptomatic treatment. Right? So it is very, very important. Unfortunately, in all governments, the ministries that deal with poverty issues tend to be the less glamorous ministries. The ministries that deal with inclusivity issues are ministries that are not so visible. So what would be all your social sector ministries? You'll have agriculture, You'll have rural development. Of course, you have women and child development. Because without including them and talking of a $20 trillion economy, unless half of our population is not equally participating in that, that dream cannot be achieved. You would have ministries like social justice, Department of Disabilities, minority affairs, SC/ST, so on and so forth. And I think what I'm trying to sensitize everybody here is, in this country, media is actually driven by what they think all of us want to hear. You are the corporate captains, you are the bankers, you are the people who control the financial sector. How many times do you really see news related to the areas that I mentioned? You don't ever see that. So I think if you look at it as a part of something that you need to also give back to the country and worry about why farmers are committing suicide, or why agriculture growth is so low, or why there is such a high rate of infant mortality, and so on and so forth, we have to put that pressure on the entire ecosystem to wake up and start looking at these issues as equally important issues to economic issues. Economy and inclusivity has to be said in the same breath. I have been doing this conferencing and writing book for many years, and one person who's kind of late been mentoring me is Mrs. Menka Sanjay Gandhi herself, who told me that what I was doing was useless, and I quite agree with her. She says, unless and until you are able to implement what you say, you have great ideas, but how do we actually implement that and actually create jobs? Even if you create 20 jobs, you would have done a bigger service than writing a book. And I so completely agree with her that it's not funny. So I have been actually scouting around with this problem. One of the biggest problem that is facing us today is that of sustainability and safe food. While a lot of people are worried about what is happening to Nestle, what is happening to Maggi, I don't know if you knew what all goes inside the tomatoes you eat and what goes inside the brinjal you eat, you'll probably stop eating. You'll go on a liquid diet. That is if your water is arsenic free. In states like Punjab, in states like Haryana, you've got cancer clusters because of overuse of pesticides, urea, overwatering, so on and so forth. So today there is a movement which is for organic farming. The Honorable Prime Minister in the last budget has put forward 380 crores for traditional farming, so to say. But even today, it is meant for the elite. The tomatoes that are for 20 rupees a kg, the minute they get an organic tag, Gurgaon Mall sell it for 45 rupees a kg. Now, some of it may be a real difference in terms of possibly it costs more. The other is a perceived high brand value, premium product kind of a thing, and that has to change. We have to mainstream organic farming, and a couple of ideas that the biggest challenge in that is the value chain. If somebody grows organic food, who is going to buy it? So people across the country have been grappling on that, and we have a workshop today which identifies those areas that if we were to actually turn one entire district organic, what could be the business plan? But it would need some out-of-the-box thinking. One idea that I have recently given is one of the biggest buyers of food is government midday meal scheme program. If the government itself can mandate that in midday scheme to our children we will serve only organic food, then wherever the food is grown, it is bought there. So there is no cold storage required, there is no transportation. Jahan ugao, wahan khao. So this is the first concept that I'm coming out with. The second concept I would like to promote is grow your own food. So I've started by growing food on my own terrace. Yesterday we went to the Port Trust of Mumbai and we saw such an amazing terrace garden in 3,000 square feet kind of an area. I mean, they had 150 odd varieties which was done by Nautico. I'm also glad that these people are here because having looked for sustainable organic farming models, the only person who's made sense to me thus far is Mr. Suchde, who has a lot of certificate. I have really not gotten deep into his model, but if whatever he says is true, then that can actually turn this whole country around, and we would want him to play a good role in this conference. Credit linkage to producer companies and cooperatives remains a very high area of concern. A lot of agricultural distress is caused because of credit linkage even to farmers. So being bankers, that's an area I think we have to look at and talk about. We have level playing field issues. When you go to a $20 trillion economy, are you going to be a closed economy? Are you going to be an open economy? Is MNC good? Is MNC bad? Is FDI good? Is FDI bad? I think in these areas, we seem to be getting somewhat mixed signals depending on who you speak with in the government. So there is a lot more clarity that is required. Some ministries are doing an excellent job. They're, very forward-looking, make in India. If you look at it, they want to, bring in a global infrastructure, so on and so forth. While if you talk to some other ministries, they sound almost Nehruvian in terms of their socialist inclination. So I think out of this churn, some good will come out, and maybe the policy direction would evolve and become much better. We have managed to get nearly 400 delegates from across the country, from across sectors, financial sector, rail sector, agriculture sector, organic farming sector, who would be contributing. But the most important thing that I am doing this morning is I am celebrating two of my best friends. One of them is yet to arrive. Rana Kapoor is a rock star, so he normally makes a late entry. And the other is Ashish Kumar Chauhan. I met Ashish Kumar Chauhan many years back when he was working for Reliance Industries. And I was doing, I have been capturing the history of contemporary reform in India. And when I was doing a film of NSDL, we wanted to get a soundbite from people like Deena Mehta. We wanted to get a soundbite from Mukesh Ambani. And he helped me with instant access to Mr. Mukesh Ambani. If people from Bombay would know, it takes a lot to do that, and he managed that soundbite for me. And ever since we've been good friends, I've seen him wearing various hats, different roles. But I think the single most important contribution that he's made since 2009 that he's taken over, Bombay Stock Exchange, he is completely turned around a 140-year-old institution which was practically being run to ground. It took 140 years to build BSE. It has seen its peaks, it's seen its low, and it has taken Ashish Kumar 5 years to turn it around. So we celebrate Ashish Kumar Chauhan for that. Later in the day, he is conferred the R.H. Patil Award for Excellence in Capital Markets. We also celebrate Yes Bank and Rana Kapoor. I had met Rana Kapoor also 10 years back, a little before this, his IPO hit and he got listed. And he was in Nehru Center in a small office. Like all people facing an imminent IPO, he was quite worried. I saw the spark in him and I decided to invest in him, and I made a documentary film on Yes Bank, a greenfield bank, then 10 years back when they had barely started the operations. And I did that at my cost, and I showcased it, and I said, these are the guys that you should really, really need to support. And I'm glad to share that he hasn't disappointed me one bit. Not only has he built in these 10 years a bank that is truly representative of an aspirational India, he has also given a new lease of life to almost a defunct association called ASSOCHAM. So if you see, ASSOCHAM has got a great new lease of life. So with that, I welcome you all once again, and I invite my colleague, Dr. Gurcharan Dhanjal, to say something about the book before the book is released.
Thank you so much. Welcome, Honorable Minister. Welcome, everyone. This is a fantastic occasion. This is the same place where maybe a decade and a half ago it would have been full of cries by this time. But today we have assembled at this historical place to celebrate 140 years plus 10 years of Yes Bank listing, as Mr. Kochhar mentioned. The book, which is what is entitled Journey of an Aspirational Nation, it's actually recounts all the various forgotten events in addition to those details, which is what have been scattered all over the place. So I will draw your attention to a few things, which is what people like Mr. Mohta sitting here, Mr. Vakil, Mr. Choksi, and several others who have contributed to the making of this institution over all these years, generation after generation. The grounds were occupied in 1874 in Dalal Street on a monthly rent of 130 rupees, which were given up when a building situated on the same street, the old Bombay Stock Exchange building, was purchased in 1895 for 97,000 rupees and inaugurated in 1899 by James Maclean, then Member of Parliament and former editor of the Bombay Gazette. Later, the new building came up as a result of Firoz Gigi Boy, called the PJ Towers, where we all sit today. The Indian markets have had the potential, and it was proven way back in 1908 when Tata Steel IPO came up. It was a convertible instrument which attracted a large number of people waiting to subscribe to it. After that, the second phase, when general public came in a big way to participate in the stock market, was Reliance Industries. It was a blessing in disguise when apparently Dhirubhai Ambani was refused by banks to fund his enterprise. So he decided to collect 1,000 rupees each from each investor for an issue size of 2.8 million. Interestingly, he himself sat around and signed all the certificates and personally handed over to the subscribers, saying that you are now a part of my enterprise and then we will grow together. And rest is history. But not everyone or everything was fine or lucky as Dhirubhai Ambani's Reliance IPO. Infosys, the software services bellwether, was instrumental in putting Indian IT prowess on the global map, had a disappointing start when it launched its IPO in 1993. Infosys IPO was undersubscribed, but Morgan Stanley bailed it out by picking up 13% of equity at the offer price of 95 rupees per share. The trading opened at 145, almost 60% premium on the day of listing. But in between, as we know, the Bombay Stock Exchange, there have always been instances where people who wanting to come to the exchange were denied entry. One such instance was Sir Chunilal Mehta, way back in the 50s. He was an influential trader, but for some reason, he was not offered the membership of the exchange. Disgruntled as he turned out, he formed his own exchange called the Mahajan Exchange, which carried on with 80 members plus for almost 15 years before merging with the Bombay Stock Exchange. Came a time when the bastion, which was all male-dominated, was about to be broken. Dinaben Mehta is sitting here. She was one of the first few women members of the Bombay Stock Exchange, which eventually went on to become its first woman president in March 2001. She recalled the days when she first entered the trading hall in 1984. Part of the problem, of course, was gender. She says, I happened to be the first woman to enter the trading ring in that period because no woman was allowed to enter the trading ring. Actually, I was not aware that there were no women traders. She was dissuaded by others, by everything, by every single instrument that was used, including saying that there are no women toilets. She took that challenge. She said, fine, I'll manage. And this is where we are. There have been turbulent times as well. The blast. That happened on a Friday. The resilience of the markets is exemplified by what follows. A day after BSE was targeted, the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Sharad Pawar, visited the exchange building and promised all help to restore facilities by the next trading day, which was Monday. BSE started functioning on the next working day after the blast, that was Monday. His words were, we are not going to be cowed down by this terrorist attack. Again, Dinaben recalls, she said, I was in the trading ring and I was 7 months pregnant. The bomb blast happened at 1:30, but had it happened at 2 p.m., more than 1,000 people would have died because all the people in the ring would have taken to the street during break. The intensity of the blast was earth-shattering. Not only that the glass ceiling fell, but part of her office, which is about half a kilometer away, caved in after 3 days. But all that is behind us. Technology has moved on. But during those days, it was primitive. There was only one supercomputer in the country, which was located at Life Insurance Corporation next door. All the trades that would happen in a day cards were punched, Sauda sheets were taken to the LIC supercomputer, and the matches and the mismatches happened. Next morning when it would come back, there would be more than 35 to 40% mismatches. And when BSE wanted to buy the first computer, it was 20 lakhs. And there was a lot of resistance. A, expensive. B, we are happy with paper. But today, with the screen-based trading, we have gone from T plus 15 to T plus 7 to T plus 1 today. A trade which is happening in 200 microseconds. Ashish's target is to take it to 20 microseconds, making 10,000 times faster than the current speed. So with this, I would recommend all of you to read the book and find out more of such interesting instances, and I invite the Honorable Minister to unveil the book. I now invite Mr. Ramadurai.
Good morning to each and every one of you present here. It's a special honor and privilege to speak on this momentous occasion. Let me extend a very warm welcome to you all on this extraordinary congregation to mark the journey of an aspiring nation. On behalf of BSE, let me welcome our special guest for the day, Srimati Maneka Gandhi, Honorable Minister for Women and Child Development, Shri Samir Kochhar, Chairman, Scotch Group and Founder, Secretary General, CEOs Association for Inclusive India, Shri Ashish Kumar Chauhan, Professor Deepak Phatak, Dr. Gursharan Danjal, Srimati Deena Mehta, and all the dignitaries that are present here. It is a great pleasure for BSE to be a part of the 40th Scotch Summit. The summit has a very interesting theme, making India a $20 trillion economy. With India well set on its growth trajectory, it's important to think and plan correctly on how to achieve this growth. Summits like these helps to bring the relevant stakeholders and the right data together, which can lead actionable insights towards achieving the goal. I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate the Scotch Group for bringing to light the 140 years journey of the Bombay Stock Exchange and the Indian capital markets, and celebrating the success story of BSE. Samir, Chairman of the Scotch Group, has been an ardent advocate of inclusive growth in India. He is a self-taught sociologist, economist. He has traversed the nation's length and breadth, studying and understanding where India's competitive advantage lie. He has been doing yeoman service by documenting the history of reforms in India and has published a number of books that have left a lasting impact on our policies. I'm glad that with this new book, he has ventured into the unexplored territory of BSE's 140 years history comprehensively. This book, capturing the institutional history of stock markets seen through the prism of BSE, is a greenfield work and is an invaluable contribution for generations to come. If you look at this International Convention Hall, this has seen the development of Indian capital markets over the past many decades, first as a trading ring for the brokers and then as a convention hall post-digitization. It's the right stage for conducting this event to discuss and deliberate on the grand vision for India. I think BSE, since its inception, has offered an efficient capital raising platform to various companies in India, and this marking the 140th year of the unique and remarkable sojourn of BSE. The institution has more or less shaped the country's capital markets starting from 1875. I think the 40th Scotch Summit is the first event where BSE's voyage of 140 years has been celebrated, a first time among the many in this commemorative string to follow. BSE has grown immeasurably over time in terms of culture, technology, process, systems, and methods. To mature as well as to brave competition, the institution has to break the mold and reinvent itself repeatedly. And after all these years, not only does the stock exchange stand tall, but it also continues to play a pivotal role as an incubator of financial enterprise in India. I think we work on the basis of an inclusive growth and equitable wealth creation. Giving access to economic opportunity and upward social mobility are exactly what capital markets do. This has become one of the largest capital stock exchanges in number of trades, number of companies listed, 5,686 to be exact, and is also the largest exchange by market capitalization in India. The new trading platform is currently the fastest in India, and they offer an order execution speed of 200 microseconds and we almost handle 5 lakh orders per second. We adhere to the highest standards of transparency and corporate governance set up by the regulators and the government. As we constantly look to explore new frontiers of the financial markets, the BSE SME Exchange platform was launched in March 2012 and owns more than 90% of the market share in the SME space. It exceeds $1 billion market capitalization and is on its way to accomplish the listing of 100 SMEs. In February, BSE launched the institutional trading platform in the BSE SME segment to facilitate essentially startup companies and SME to list without an IPO. More recently, BSE, the Confederation of Indian Industry, and IICA Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, have collaborated on an initiative called Samman, the world's first CSR exchange, which was launched by the Honorable President of India, Shri Pranab Mukherjee, on the 29th of April in New Delhi. This platform would enable companies to undertake effective CSR by acting as the trusted intermediary between the corporates and NGOs. This is a much-needed initiative to ensure smooth compliance with the new CSR requirements of the Companies Act. BSE itself has a robust CSR policy and undertakes various types of CSR activities in terms of social welfare, community development, education, and environment. BSE Training Institute, a subsidiary of BSE, this essentially is responsible for imparting knowledge on markets and economics, touches almost 40,000 students, teaching them on the investments, financial market careers. Number of collaborations have been set up, and an incubation center within BSE was set up in the last year, which provides space and financing to more than 43 companies. DST, the Department of Science and Technology, announced yesterday a contribution of 5 crores to this incubation center. The vision of BSE is that it must be recognized as a torchbearer of wealth creation the world over. BSE has come a long way and is an institution under continuous transformation. The journey of BSE Limited is as eventful and interesting as the history of India's securities market. In fact, every leading corporate in India has sourced BSE Limited services in raising capital and is listed with BSE Limited. I would like to wish BSE the very best as it continues in its eventual journey forward. I would also like to congratulate Yes Bank for completing 10 years of successful listing at the BSE and Mr. Rana Kapoor for his leadership in steering the company to achieve its milestones. On behalf of BSE, I once again like to welcome each and every one of you personally and look forward to some interesting discussions over the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now invite Deena Ben to say a few words. Take maybe 2 or 3 minutes, please.
Honorable Minister Srimati Menka Gandhi, Chairman BSE Mr. Ramadurai, Mr. Samir Kochar, Ashish Chavan, CEO BSE, Mr. Gursharan, Dr. Gursharan I would say, and Dr. Pathak, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to be here today. I have been part of the 30 years of the 140-year history, which is of the stock exchange. And I am happy that being the first woman to be associated with the exchange, I have been more of a trendsetter and not just a trailblazer. Because subsequent to my entry, lot of women have joined the stock market, and by the time the ring closed, we had about 50 women. So between 1985 to 1995, 50 plus women were part of the trading ring when the ring closed, and we moved on to automated trading. And if we look at the history, like in any technology, advancements which happened, we always say that every 18 months, the costs are made 1/4 or halved, and the power of computing, it doubles or triples. And I think same thing has happened in BSE also. The book has done a good justice to tracing the history of the exchange right from 1875, when the Civil War took place in US, and it coincided with the opening of the Suez Canal. And followed by that, there were a lot of companies which got promoted in India, which were essentially banking companies, textile companies, railway movement companies, and all these companies required a platform, and that is how the stock exchange came about. Of course, the stock exchange essentially was for the members. You know, a lot of people have called BSE as a brokers club. But if you look at the inception and the constitution of the exchange, it was meant to be an association for the members and by the members. Only post 70s when Mr. George Fernandez insisted upon fairer dilutions, that public first time participated. And of course followed that by Dhirubhai Ambani, who really tapped on the power of the markets and saw to it that the markets are a channelizing agency for providing money to the household savings to the industry, and that was truly demonstrated by Dhirubhai with the huge public issues which happened. But if we look at the last 3 decades, I would say, is where the major development has happened. If we look at 90s, post-liberalization by Dr. Manmohan Singh, we saw a huge amount of industrial and other activities happen. The 2000 decade, if we see, was a decade when SEBI underwent a transformation. SEBI got a lot of powers, and laws like insider trading, FUTP, and these kind of laws came about, and the takeover code, all these were strengthened. So the 2000 decade gave us real power, and because of that, in the 2000 decade, 3 important things happened. One was the depository was set up. Second thing, the trade guarantee funds came about. And third was automated trading. I think these are the 3 pillars of the modern day stock market as they stand. And these are the pillars on which the entire world has come to look at India with great respect so far as markets are concerned. The takeoff in FII investments, which happened after 2003-04, is essentially because of this fantastic infrastructure which was developed by the exchanges, and this also attracted a lot of retail investors into the market. And then if we look at the current decade, it has been of derivatives exchange and explosion in volumes. The volumes in which in late 80s, I would say, was around 200 crore per day. During Harshad Mehta time, it came to 600 crore, and today we are 3 lakh plus crore. So you can imagine the huge explosion in volumes which has happened. And I think this fast development, and now if we look today, you know, with 200 microseconds response time which Ashish has managed to get for the stock exchange, I would say that in next 5 years, what we will see, the amount of changes with the new government in place and the kind of power which has been given to the markets, we would see lot of phenomenal changes. So I would say that each decade was, you know, if you look at banking is today third generation, but I think stock exchanges would be something like 5th generation. And I hope that today we have a problem in the markets where retail investors are still not attracted. And the purpose of any stock exchange is to mobilize the household savings through the market to the industry. And I am happy that Bombay Stock Exchange has gone on a path where SME exchange is given importance, where mutual fund mobilization is given importance, and we are also going to get into retail investors buying government securities in the market. So this original purpose, I am happy that as we stand today at 140th year, Ashish has really made this exchange into a new generation exchange which would serve the purpose for which it was created. And my compliments and best wishes to Ashish and team. And sir, you have done a remarkable job, Mr. Kochar, because this book idea, you will not believe, I have been trying to write a book or get a book written by exchange for almost 10 years. We have been trying, Ashish and myself, that we must write a book and capture the history. And I can also promise you that this is not going to be the first and the only book on BSc history. We are going to come up with a couple of more books on BSc history because the history is so vast that I am sure that even 10 books if we write, we would still have some more material to write. So thank you very much, and I am really honored by the citations and other things you have quoted me in the book. I am really thankful and honored, and I feel privileged to be part of this great organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I have the privilege of inviting the Honorable Minister, Mrs. Menaka Gandhi.
Mr. Samir Kochhar, Mr. Ramadurai, the legend Deena Mehta ji, Professor Pathak, the CEO of the BSc, Ashish Chauhan ji, Shri Dhanjal, the absent Mr. Rana, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to this, to the release of the book, and to use this as an excuse to see the legendary stock exchange, which we've heard about, but I've never had the privilege of seeing. The theme of the summit is making India a $20 trillion economy. And with a new government in, and a government which everybody is very hopeful about, this is a timely aspiration. A nation can only grow as big as its people's dreams. Today our dreams are big, but dreams need to encompass the unknown. Today, because it's a different kind of audience, it's an audience that makes or breaks companies by lending, by investing. I'm constitutionally incapable of reading a speech. So I'm just going to give you a few ideas that I have on how we could achieve, say, $20 trillion. It can't be just upscaling what we already have. It has to take a leap into the unknown. Now, since Mr. Ramadurai is here, I'm going to tell you the background to this. I invented a scheme in my ministry called STEP. STEP was about, or is about, I will give money to any that trains 200 women at a time and gets them employment. Now we advertised this scheme. We got 4,300 responses, of which 4,200 were about teaching women tailoring, stitching, and embroidery. It was so annoying that in this huge country, all we could think of is just more stitching, more tailoring, more embroidery for women. There wasn't a single idea in the entire bunch that we got, so I stopped the scheme. Now, I thought I'd share a few of my thoughts with you. If you want to scale, and if you want to make everybody a part of this upliftment, you have to look at different areas. One would be food. At the moment, we are importing dal. We are importing a lot of food. Are we going to keep doing that, or are we going to look at new paradigms of creating food? For instance, one of the things Mr. Kochhar has talked about, and which is very close to my heart, is going organic. But can we go organic in the ether? Can we go organic without anything behind it? Sikkim has shown us the way. Sikkim first passed an act saying, so they laid the rule basis, saying that nobody will put fertilizer and pesticide. That was an actual law. After which they started training. Every farmer, first they trained 800 young boys and girls, to be teachers. After which they put them into every school, and every farmer and every young person had to study for 3 hours a day, twice a week, on how to turn their fields organic or their dreams organic. Today, just within 3 years, Sikkim is completely organic. Its products, its produce are worth more than anything else we grow in India. They have a huge export market. Why? If we are going to go organic, it has to be using education, it has to be using investment. We can't treat organic as a luxury, something that you eat once a week on Sundays, or something that Nature's Harvest will sell, or niche stores will take a leap. It has to be absolutely the basis of what we grow. This will save us 1.5 lakh crores of import a year in just urea alone. It will save us from famine, which is upon us. For instance, to give you one small example, not small, it's a huge example. We have imported something, or we are using, since 2003, we're using something called nicotinoid pesticides. These pesticides were invented by Bayer, subsequently by another company. They came into India and all over the world, and now it's 1/4 of all the pesticides we use are neonicotinoid. We specially use them for growing cotton. The same BT cotton, which said that we are going to be the next generation because we won't need pesticides, now uses more pesticide than anything else in the world. Now, this neonicotinoid pesticide, and you're most welcome to look at them, they've now discovered within 6 years that has wiped out the entire bee stock of the world. 75% of bees, who are your only pollinators for most crops, have disappeared. And it's been linked specifically to neonicotinoids. Now, England has put them under investigation because they found that Bayer and the other companies had lied while getting clearances. Europe has banned it for 2 years. America has put it under investigation. India won't touch the ban or even investigate because we need them for growing cotton. But do we need BT cotton? Do we need cotton that is so expensive? Because if we lose the bees, which we are losing rapidly, we won't have any pollinators in India. So should we look at pollination as a food necessity, or should we look at pesticides? These are the questions that will come up every day for organic food. And no organic food can be created unless the BSC, unless you people decide that India will be organic. It's not government. The second way of growing food is to look at complete alternatives. The same way as now we cannot imagine a world without computers. There is another revolution coming up, and it is coming up in America, the country that invented Silicon Valley and changed the way we are. And that is alternative foods. Food that are produced in Petri dishes rather than using huge amounts of land. We are never going to not eat meat. In fact, India is now eating more meat than Europe, just India alone. So what do we do? If you use one cow, uses 11, or one cow, one goat, takes 11 kilos of grain and green to produce 1 kilo of meat. It's the most inefficient conversion of energy ever. So what have they started doing? Instead of putting bans and saying go vegetarian, go this, go that, which is wonderful, but impractical, in Silicon Valley, groups of people have now started inventing meat created from cells. Just the same meat, but without using animals that need land, need food, need feeding. And last year, the first hamburger was created by Mark Post of the University of Utrecht. But there are companies now which are doing alternative milk, the real milk, but created in labs. Real meat created in labs. Isha Dattar runs a company called New Horizons from Washington. Who are her main investors? Google, Microsoft, that amazing company from Hong Kong, which is invested in every single startup, which has done well. All these people who envisioned a new world with computers are the ones that are now investing hugely into food that is created using the same elements, just multiplying cells. If we can clone plants, we can clone cells. This will be the food of the very near future. By the end of this year, there will be milk in all over America called Moo Free. invented by 2 Indians who got their degrees in Tamil Nadu in biotechnology and are working at this company called MoveFree. So this is another startup that you should be looking at. The third would be monetizing gobar. In 1960, when Pandit Nehru decided that India needed fertilizers and pesticides, within 1 year, every village, which till today in 2015 doesn't have a school, had a shop selling urea and pesticides, and a huge blitz telling people why they needed to use it for the Green Revolution. Now we know the Green Revolution has got lots of terrible, terrible things in its wake. It has brought in diseases that are household names now, like cancer. It's actually not increased the food beyond a point, but made the land completely hungry for water which we don't have. So should we now not monetize gobar? Do startups, which now in every village, they have shops that sell organic fertilizer, organic pesticides. That would be another area which we have to go into sooner or later. Either we do it today, kushi, or we do it after the 10 millionth farmer has committed suicide. But either which way, we've got to do it. Now, in Nagpur, there are 8 villages that have formed a cooperative, and they simply do, young boys, 20 years old, they came across an interesting idea, which is what the $10 trillion dream is going to consist of. And they buy urine, cow urine from the whole village every day for 1 rupee. And they keep it for a day, and then when it's what they call matured, 2 days later, they sell it for 2 rupees. And the farmers buy it. In these 8 villages, the crop has gone up by 18%. This is recorded, studied by government industries. Now, if we can do that, you don't have to import at some point. If we can just push up the crop, reduce the monies that they have to take from the market for buying for buying pesticides and fertilizer, and yet push up the produce, then you will have to use what you normally have, which is indigenous fertilizer and indigenous pesticide. The second is water. We are in the middle of a water crisis. What is the difference between rich and poor? The rich drink this water, and the poor drink from taps which may or may not exist. The only difference between rich and poor now is water. And that difference is going to become less and less as we ourselves starve the water. Do you think that we can carry on using this? This comes from a stream in the Himalayas. It comes from drilling holes in the mountains and pulling up water from Himachal. Himachal is effectively feeding the rest of India water. Can Himachal do this for very long? No, because they themselves are reaching a point where their streams are drying up and they are water starved. Coca-Cola takes its water from deep drilling in Rajasthan. Does Rajasthan have enough water to feed its own people? No. The lack of water destroys people. In Hyderabad, 16 million liters of water are given to Al-Kabir to wash cow carcasses, buffalo carcasses. And the women of Hyderabad line up from 2 to 3 every morning, plastic buckets on head, to just pick up water because it's only available between 2 and 3 in the morning from the municipal tap. Can we ask those women to produce something for India after that when they haven't slept one night properly? So the water will have to be next on our agenda, not only how we save it, but how we create it. Can you turn water vapor into water? Can we do it through condensation? Yes, we can. There is a technician and an inventor in Tamil Nadu who was taken to Ethiopia, and there he created water for the Ethiopians, simply showing them how you decentralize water management, the creation of water, and how every village could just use ghadas or large tanks to turn water vapor into water. I introduced him to Gujarat. He tried to do it, but again, bureaucracy was not terribly welcoming to a new idea. Can you turn salt water into water? Of course we know we can. We have the technology. Do we use it? Everything has to be decentralized for us to get food put down. Instead of having a pole line service, we have to look at each village and do a DPR for each village. What does it need to be self-sufficient in food, water, energy? Energy. There is a book which I must insist that you read, even if you read no other book in the world, including the history of the BSc. Hello, Mr. Rana. You must read Gunter Pauli's Blue Planet. It's about how one man took an area in Colombia, and now he's gone to Johannesburg, and he's done different things, new inventions, small inventions, but which push up the economy by millions of dollars, just millions. What has he done? He, for instance, has invented, there are 800 people who work with him, and all they do is invent amazing things. For instance, they run their cars on turpentine, and they run without changing the basic, the machinery of the car, but they run on turpentine. Where do they get the turpentine? They grow pine trees. The pine trees deliver resin. Resin is filtered into turpentine, and they run them. Why don't we grow? We don't have any trees left, but we could have resinous trees. They have now gone to Johannesburg and they found that Johannesburg spent most of its money making bread or eating bread. So they've invented solar bakeries, and the same solar bakeries with new kinds of solar, because they've invented a solar, battery that works at 5 times the normal solar battery, just from adding water. It's used to power street lights as well from the bakeries. The most amazing invention that he's done, which China has bought, is inventing paper from granite and stone dust. And he was selling books made from that paper, which were amazing. China, buying this invention, has already put it into use and expects to save 270 million trees this year simply from using his invention. Why can't we do the same? He is giving it free. We have to look at new ways of housing. How long can we arrest people for stealing sand? How long can you just keep aspiring towards cement-built houses that don't even last one monsoon? You may have the houses that you have in the city, but I'm talking about 6 lakh villages need new ways to build houses. Adobe is a good idea. Dr. Ashok Khosla has been trying to build adobe houses for the last 50 years without much success, because he has no banking background. He has no startup money. But if we were to invest in Adobe bricks, we would be able to get to the next level of Adobe, and everybody could make their houses with the mud that they actually have under their feet. Instead of importing cement, instead of stealing sand, instead of picking up things that we don't need from other places. Look at clothes. As I said, it's not BT cotton which needs it, but you need to have more intensive work into new fibers. Look at today's Indian Express. It's got a story of a man who is not terribly educated, but has done the most amazing thing. He's taken the stubble that we burn. Every day our fields are on fire, especially with rice paddy. I have made it illegal in my constituency, but it doesn't work. Even making it illegal, they will still burn it. And the smaller the farmer, the more he will burn. And when he burns his field, it is weaker for the next time and weaker for the next time and needs more water. And so the cycle becomes worse and worse and worse. There's no 20 trillion future for us if we can't stop that. So what has this man done? he has found a way to turn stubble into cardboard. So he earns 40,000 rupees an acre just simply selling the cardboard, which he pays to farmers who give him their stubble. So he's monetized an unmonetizable product. That's where we need to think. We need to invest in this man. We need to look at health. If we're not well, what can we do? And one of the reasons we're not well is because we take so many antibiotics. But if you actually look at a solution for antibiotic, we're getting it through our meat, mainly through chicken. How do you sort out 70% of antibiotics in India being given to chickens? Why do they give them? Because chickens are given this much place in battery cages to stand. So they fight with each other. So to prevent fighting with each other, as soon as they're born, chicken breeders cut their mouths. They cut their beaks off, they cut their toes off. And because they're tiny at that point, they do it without anesthesia, so the chicken remains sick. And to prevent more sickness through the bad food they give, through the cramping of this teeny weeny bird, they have to keep it alive for a minimum of 4 to 6 months so that you get a big fat chicken. They give it hormones. And because hormones make it even sicker, they give it antibiotics. But were we to give this chicken more space to live, your antibiotics would disappear. So you have to look at solutions which don't even cost money, but they're so radical that they change the way we live. You need, for instance, to, if I were to say do one thing that saves India, it would not be anything else except plant forests, plant forests, plant forests, plant forests, plant forests, nothing else. If you do that, sounds so strange, but your forests give you food, your forests give you employment, your forests will stabilize the weather. We are not going to have any food if we don't stabilize the weather. Today we are in the middle of a major crisis because it rained and the hail came all over North India. It destroyed the wheat crop. How much has it cost the government of India? Thousands of crores in simple compensation. In my own constituency, the amount of money that we have given in compensation goes to over 50 crore rupees. Can we afford it? Why not just stabilize the weather instead? And it could be done so easily. It could be done by looking at cloning, which Andhra Pradesh started and then abandoned for some reason in the 80s. It could be done through people doing startups on just forests. You and I, rich people and poor people, use 7 trees a year. With the rich, use it for furniture, for paper, for rayon, for packaging. The poor use it to burn, to create carts. If we were to plant back just the trees we use, you would get your energy from there, you would get weather stabilization, you'd get everything. I was in Burma 2 years ago, and my interpreter was a young boy called Win. Both his parents had died of bone cancer, strangely enough. And in both cases, he said there was so much pain that could have been involved, but they found a really common vine that grows there. And he fed them a couple of leaves every day, and till they died, there wasn't a titch button of pain. I asked him to send me the vine, and he did. It's one of the most common vines we use in India. We just simply haven't thought of it. So we need, again, to put startups instead of looking down on, say, Ayurveda, or changing it into some kind of quack medicine. We need to actually put our money, or you need to put your money, into startups that involve medicines that are so easily available to us and which would arise by themselves. My mother had hepatitis. And a friend of mine wrote to me and said, I'm sending you some herbs which cured me of hepatitis A. So she sent them, and when I looked at them, they were in my garden. They were in my garden as jungly weeds that we were uprooting every day. Again, we need more education on this. There is not a single course in India that teaches you proper horticulture, that teaches you about plants. We need to change an education system. We need to put money into changing systems or introducing new things that would teach us to reach the 2 trillion mark. will give you just two more things that could change India. One of the things that has been invented, when I went for the elections, I asked one of my great heroes, Professor Anil Gupta of IIM, who is an inventor and who has invented more things to save India than anybody could, but lacks money, who the president recognizes and gives awards for best inventions every year. I asked him to make me a machine to make gobar logs. When I came back, within a month, he had done it. It's a small machine with a long thing like this. You just put gobar into it, squeeze it so that the moisture comes out, dry it so it becomes adobe. What are we using it for? Every day, over 1 lakh of people die in India. I mean, 1 lakh is an understatement, but a minimum of 1 lakh. Every day, more or less, we burn them. It takes 600 kilos of wood to burn one person. And now because we've run out of shrub, we are now using mango wood. We are using all sorts of wood. It costs more than 10,000 to burn somebody. It is also destroying our forests more than even so-called development. So what do? Now we use gobar. If you use gobar logs with samagri in it, it is as sacred, people will do it. How did we start? My Gaushala in Delhi, my animal shelter, which also has cows in it, we didn't know what to do with that gobar nuisance. Every day we were paying people to take it away. Now we have a contract for Nigambodh Ghat, which takes it for 4 rupees a kilo. I am earning 60,000 rupees a month just selling gobar logs. If one were to put their money and start a gobar log, just give it to every village, they would stop going to the jungle and cutting 10 trees every day to burn whoever has died. Otherwise you can't stop it. You're losing more forests by the minute, and you're losing your crops, your weather, your life, your water, because somebody's died. So should we put it into companies like this? What we need in India is not just a ministry for skill development, and I speak to Mr. Ramadurai on this. We need a ministry for invention. We need to pay for people to send you inventions. Look at the inventions that 800 patents just Anil Gupta has got. What kind of inventions? Right from, if you sleep at your table in an office, the computer stops working. If you don't sit up straight. Right from a washing machine that in a village you can pedal with, to this gobar machine. He has invented bricks that you can make again out of gobar using a little bit of thatch in it. He has invented a cycle that is used in Bihar during the floods. It actually rows oars which can be tucked in without increasing the weight. He has developed a crutch, a simple thing, a crutch which allows you, which goes up and down and which allows a disabled person to climb stairs without swinging it out and being terribly uncomfortable and feeling embarrassed. It's a simple little device. And he has 800 of these. And we need to incorporate inventions. You need to have a website. And you need to actually invest in them. You need to start thinking laterally. What is it that is going to save India? What is going to take us to the $20 trillion mark? We can do it, but we need to think completely fresh. Every decade, as Dina Mehta said, every decade takes us somewhere else. And we cannot keep repeating in terms of scale. Simply, okay, so I earned 800 rupees, so now I'm going to earn 1,000 rupees and live happily ever after. Not at all. You need to spread out laterally, and for that, a ministry of invention and an inventive audience, an inventive bankers, inventive investors is what we need if we're going to make the grade. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing such inspiring ideas. I think the road moving ahead, the two catchwords, one is innovation and second is out-of-the-box thinking. We've been thinking, but now we need to think differently. With this, I quickly invite Mr. Vijay Mehta. He has been in possession of some 1920s and 1930s share certificates which he would like to present to Mr. Ramadorai.